Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the Pseudo-Trompowsky or the Levitsky attack or the Hodgson attack, an opening that has many names, but is in essence the Trompowsky against 1d5 by black. So after a long think I've decided to include it in the Trompowsky series, even though it's not the Trompowsky technically, but I believe it belongs here. So instead of playing knight f6 for black on move 1, black would play d5, which is the move I play and that many people play, against which the Trompowsky simply cannot be played. So this is the Trompowsky, and if black plays d5, you cannot play the Trompowsky. You can, however, play the Pseudo-Trompowsky, which is an opening we are going to have a look at today. Bishop g5. Anyway, now what's the point? Well, firstly, this gets the bishop to a very good square. It pins the e-pawn, which means that e6 and e5 are very hard to play. Secondly, if knight f6 is played, this I should mention at start, have a look at the last video in the Trompowsky series. This transposes to the d5 lines of the Trompowsky for black. So for example, d4, knight f6, bishop g5, d5. And we have this position in which white can take on f6, which is the principled move, or white can play e3, knight d2, something else. But basically, by playing bishop g5, white is giving himself the option to induce this structural weakness on black's position, double his f-pawns, trade off his bishop very early in the game, and create an imbalance. Now, there are two weaknesses created by this move, which are very serious, which some of them are similar to what happens in the Trompowsky. One of them is similar to what happens in the Trompowsky. One of them is even more highlighted. Now, the first weakness that the Levitsky attack or the Pseudo-Trompowsky shares with the Trompowsky is the weakness on b2. As we know, in many openings like the Torre attack, the London system, any opening where the bishop marches out too early, then there's a problem with b2. So for example, c6 or c5 followed by queen b6 is a very common way to punish white for playing in such a fashion. In the London system, in the symmetrical London system with d4, d5, queen b6 is one of the moves that black always tries to play and that white always has a hard time responding to. So this is one weakness. Because this bishop has moved, and as we saw in some lines of the Trompowsky, sometimes retreating it to c1 is best. Because the bishop has moved, b2 is weak. The second weakness, which we don't get in the Trompowsky but we get here, is that the bishop could be chased away, so you can gain time, you can gain tempi without any consequences. When your knight is on f6, for example, let's have a look at the Trompowsky. If black plays h6 here, then taking on f6 is great. This is just perfect. Once d5 is played and bishop g5, there is no knight that could be taken on f6. So h6 and f6 are free tempo moves, which are in fact two of the three most popular ways to play against the Pseudo-Trompowsky. So you can gain free tempo on the bishop. What's even more important, should the bishop wander away from this diagonal, so for example after f6 or h6, bishop h4, then the bishop is no longer able to defend the queen side, which could have devastating consequences. And unlike some other openings in which the bishop can retreat, that could be quite dangerous. Now, those are the downsides for white. The downside for black is, I think, mainly psychological. Nobody really takes this opening seriously. I'm a very good example. I've been playing d4, d5 for 3 years. I've never had a look at this. I've never faced it in a tournament game, well, which I should be grateful for, because I would have lost. But I've never had a serious look at it up until a year ago, when I was playing a friend online who plays this sometimes, and then I decided to study it. But basically, the disadvantage for black is mainly psychological, in a sense that black doesn't think he should know something about this, which cannot be farther from the truth. Basically, if you don't know how to play against this, you are not going to lose quickly. There's a chance you will lose, but you will not get a chance to equalize easily. And if you study this opening properly, there's a way to have an inevitable edge over white. It requires precise preparation and precise play, and good play, but there's a way to have an advantage. The other disadvantage for black is that he has to choose between basically 10 good moves. Okay, so f6, h6, they make a lot of sense. c6, c5, they make a lot of sense. Knight f6, as we said, transposes to the Trompowsky. You can play g6. You can play bishop f5, playing the London system. You can play knight c6. You can play knight d7. All of these moves are really good. You can also play bishop g4, which is called the Wellington variation, which is trying to copy white. So how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, 10 moves. So all of these moves are fine, and none of them give white a great advantage. I would say that the move bishop g4, the Wellington variation, is just the worst move you could play, because you are playing the Pseudo-Trompowsky yourself, and white is a tempo up. So white should play f3, which is the principled move, and black has to play f6. There's just nothing better. And this position, even though it's bad for both sides, is better for white because white is tempo up. So occupying these squares, white is going to be quicker to do it. Breaking with h4 or e4, white is going to be quicker to do that. Also c4, and this is just not a good position for black. It's not a good position for either side, but basically don't try to play symmetrically. Even though it's not losing, it should be slightly better for white. Okay, we are going to have a look at 4 moves in detail, which I think are just the best moves. These 4. The other I'm going to show you fairly quickly. Okay, firstly, c5. c5 is a very interesting option, breaking the center and giving our queen access to b2. So this makes a lot of sense. If d takes c5 is played, which may be counterintuitive, white should be slightly better. The reason black does this is you want to expand freely with e5, which I should have mentioned at start. Once you gain a tempo on this bishop, then it's possible to play e5 in many positions. So here, after the d4 pawn has disappeared, you play f6, the bishop retreats, and you play e5. And this position after e4, which is white's only good move, and black's very intuitive d4 is better for white. But if black knows the engine lines, which nobody would know here, for some reason h5 is the best move. I did not even try to understand this. After f3, saving the bishop, now black plays d4 and the engine thinks black is fine. I'm not sure. This is an ugly position for black. I wouldn't want to play it with black. I would rather be white. This pawn is going to be undermined sooner or later. For the moment, white is also a pawn up. A pawn that cannot be defended easily, but it can be defended. This bishop is not bad at all. It could retreat to f2. So c5, even though it's visually a good move, and visually it may seem nice to do this, the resulting position after best play by the engine is not pleasant. And if you play d4, then white should be better already. So that's c5, a move that I think many people would be tempted to play, but I don't think that they should play it. Okay, then second option, just briefly, knight f6 transposes to the Trompowsky. So bishop f6, ef6, e3. This is the Trompowsky with d5. You can find the video. It's actually the previous video in the series. Fine. Okay, now knight d7. Knight d7 is a weird move, and this usually transposes to the knight f6 Trompowsky. Why? Because the point behind knight d7 is we want to play knight f6 without white being able to take. So, for example, e3, knight f6, knight f3, we are now in the d5 Trompowsky. It could also be called the Torre attack, so it's one of those 2 openings, for example, e6, knight bd2, bishop e7. This is just very normal now. This is a normal opening in which white has a slight advantage, white has a better bishop, black has to do something about this. So, no, I'm not a big fan of this because the bishop is still on c8. That being said, I've played positions like this a million times, and there are ways to get the bishop out. Usually with c5 or e5, but you can also play b6, bishop b7, and then play for c5. So it's fine. It's not a bad position. Okay, so that's knight d7. You can also play g6 that transposes to Indian positions with d5. So sometimes you could have something resembling the Grunfeld. The problem is that white doesn't have to play c4, so white could avoid Grunfeld type of positions and just play calmly. So g6 cannot be bad. It's an okay move, but I don't think it makes a ton of sense because you are combining modern and classical responses to d4 without too many issues for white to deal with. I don't think this is unpleasant for white. I think white should have an advantage. This has been played a million times from a million different openings, but it's not challenging. And if white plays imprecisely on move 2 with bishop g5, then there are better ways to punish that. Okay, one way which I do like is bishop f5, which we are going to go over in detail. And then there's knight c6. This is the last move I would like to mention before we get on to the 4 good moves. This is a tricky way to play because you're putting pressure on this pawn. You're not expanding with c5, but instead you're preparing an expansion with e5. So that makes perfect sense. So for example, f6, bishop h4. Here you could play e5 straight away. You could also play knight h6, which we are going to see in some other lines, the idea of which is, of course, knight f4, challenging the bishop. I'm not a big fan of Chigorin type of positions because of knight c6, but that's very subjective. So if you like Chigorin for either color, or the Jobava-London system, for example, then this is fine. Now, let's get on to the 4 good moves, which black could play. Actually, really good moves. The first move I would like to mention is c6. This is going to be very similar to what we see in lines where black chases the bishop away first and then goes on to play with queen b6. So usually this will start with pawn to h6, the bishop being chased away, and then c6, queen b6. But you could play c6 without inserting one of these 2 moves. Now, since h6 is by far the most popular move played by strong players, and f6 is by far the best engine move against the Pseudo-Trompowsky, then c6, which is also really good and very close to those 2, may be a good way to confuse your opponents with black, and white has to know what to do about this. And the problem for white is that this bishop is sort of in the air. Usually white is used to moving that bishop around a lot, but white just continues e3. Black plays queen b6, which is standard, and now queen c1 is the best move whenever black plays queen b6 here. You can also play b3, but queen c1 is just better, as we are going to see in the main line. So queen c1, and now black plays bishop f5. And this, I think, is really nice. White plays knight to f3, black can play e6 or knight d7, let's say knight to d7, and now c4 breaking the center, knight g to f6. And notice that we've only played knight f6 after we have defended the f6 square once more. So in this position, there is no way black could have any issues. And after knight c3, e6, black is playing a very calm London system without any weaknesses, and basically has a nice position. This, you could say, is a London system in reverse completely. For some reason the queen is now on c1, which well stops bishop d3, for example. So I really like this position for black, and there's really no way for white to avoid playing against this setup. So after c6 there's just nothing better than e3. After queen b6 there's just nothing better than queen c1. Now of course you play bishop f5, and after knight f3 with knight d7, firstly you prevent knight e5, secondly you prepare knight f6, and then next move e6. After that you play bishop d6, you castle kingside. This is just a very pleasant position. When I was preparing against the Pseudo-Trompowsky, I'd prepared this, and I think this is really nice. Gets away from mainline theory. You basically don't play theory, you play the London system. So if you're familiar with the London system with white or with black, then this is a great way to start. Another option to play the London system is to play bishop f5 on move 2, and this again will lead to a very simple London system in reverse. In fact, after e3, c6, these positions will transpose easily. It's just that you haven't inserted queen b6, which you haven't inserted it early, which is okay. You don't have to put pressure on this pawn. Queen c1 is not so bad for white. So basically, by playing bishop f5, you decide not to go for queen b6. You could, but you don't have to. Okay, knight f3, knight d7. Basically, you don't have time for queen b6 because then knight e5 would come, which is annoying. Knight d7, c4, knight g6, knight c3, e6, and this position we've seen before. It's just that the queen is not on c1 and the queen is not on b6, so white is able to trade his bishop off on d3, which is what black usually does in the London system. So if you flip the board, change the colors, this is the London system. And this is nice for both sides. I mean, both sides have something to play for. Of course, black would like to play for the e4 square, white would like to do something on the queen side, and again, watch the series on the London system. If you're not familiar with this, you will find all the answers there. So, after bishop g5, the two ways to play the London are bishop f5 and c6. Now, let's have a look at the engine first choice. Objectively the best move, and if you are brave enough to play this, because it's going to be a bit mental, and if you are patient enough to learn it, and it's not hard to learn, then this is a way to always have an advantage out of the opening against the Pseudo-Trompowsky. After this move, black is better. And on depth 38, the engine says this is the best move, and well, I think the results in Grandmaster play sort of prove that. Black scores 40% of the time, wins 40% of the time, white wins 29% of the time, and about 30% of the games are drawn. So this is a really good opening for black. One example, Morozevich Nakamura 2012, Nakamura won. Okay, we're going to have a look at three moves: bishop d2, bishop f4, and bishop h4. Bishop d2, the engine thinks is best, but it's slightly passive and it's almost never played. The idea is here for black to just use the fact that white is playing passively, play knight c6, e5 very early and blast through the center. And after e3, e5, black just has an advantage. This is a very strong center, which white has nothing to compensate for that, basically. Okay, so here, for example, e takes d4, e takes d4, and knight e7, and this is pleasant. It's just pleasant for black. Not that black is much better, but black is equal or slightly better. It's minus 0.2, minus 0.3, so that's nice. That being said, this bishop is passive, so no human would willingly play this when there are trickier options, and basically people who play the Pseudo-Trompowsky want tricky. Now, bishop h4 is the main move, therefore let's look at bishop f4 first. This is the sideline. The reason why many people avoid bishop f4, I think, when they are not well prepared, is because it seems to run into e5, but it's not the reason this is inferior to bishop h4. Now, there are two ways to play this. You could play knight c6 and then play for e5, which can be prevented with the immediate knight f3, and then black plays bishop g4. So let me show you that. Knight c6 preparing e5, knight f3 preventing e5, bishop g4 preparing e5, knight bd2 preventing e5, because if bishop takes, knight takes, e5, pawn takes. Okay, so in this position black can win a pawn, and this is a very old trick found in many e4 e5 games. Knight takes d4, and after knight takes d4, e5 now forks two pieces. However, black is a pawn up, but after h3, bishop h5, c4, white, while black is getting his piece, white is going to create a very complex position. So e takes d4 is the main move, queen b3 attacking here and here. Knight e7, black has to start developing and has to defend this pawn. So after queen b7, for example, queen c8, queen b5 check, c6, queen a4, white is slightly better, because black's position is kind of destroyed and none of the pawns are in the correct place. Therefore, after bishop f4, I think the principled way to play is not to go for e5, but to play c5. And this is extremely aggressive. Now here, if you take the pawn, then e5 comes with tempo, so you defend your center. And now knight c6. And this is obviously better because your c pawn is not on c7. So now, okay, knight f3, and now g5. And this is better for black, but it's risky. After bishop to g3, you play h5, h3, h4, bishop h2, and for example, cd, ed. You have a ton of space, but your light squares are terminally irreparably weak. If this bishop manages to find a nice home somewhere, I don't know, then black could be better. That being said, b2 is weak, white is far away from castling, e5 could be played, and if black manages to castle queenside, which I think should be the correct plan here, then I think black should have an edge. And this has never been played. I think, okay, here, there are some games in this position. Black has never played h4 here. Black tried knight h6 or c takes d4. 4 games played from this position. Black won all 4 because there's just too much space here. But I think h4 is very interesting. Why not gain another tempo? So that's bishop f4. Against bishop f4, I really think c5 is... It's very aggressive and it should be more pleasant. Okay, now, bishop h4. This is the main move for white and the best move for white. And the way to punish this is really interesting. And here is the main reason black should play f6. This is just the best move. You play knight h6. And now there's no way to save yourself from losing a few more tempi. Playing bishop g3 voluntarily doesn't really make much sense. I mean, you can, but okay. So e3 developing. And now knight f5 and bishop g3 here, once the knight has attacked the bishop. You could also play bishop d3. And in this position, knight h4, queen h5. If you play knight g6, then bishop g6, of course, wins the bishop because the pawn is pinned to the rook. So g6 and queen takes h4. This can be played, but again, black should be slightly better. Bishop g3 is considered to be stronger, and now h5, attacking the bishop. And this has been played in Grandmaster games. This is, for example, Michael Adams, Luke Van Wiele. As I said, Roy Hodgson was sort of the pioneer of this opening in the 80s and 90s. And then some English players took this opening and played it. But it never really got too popular. Okay, h5. Bishop e2 attacks the pawn, h4. In this position, you are not losing a piece yet. There are tricks, so just watch what happens. Bishop h5 check. King d7. Bishop f4. Now, okay, you've saved your bishop. g5 attacking the bishop again, but e4 attacking the knight. And all of these moves, you just have to know if you want to play f6 with black. The good news is that white has to know them too. So in this position, d4, d5, this is just very aggressive. And taking the bishop leads to all sorts of mad positions. So g takes f4, bishop g4, and this is just... The king now has to move if you don't do anything. If you do this, then you lose. And if you don't take the bishop in this position, then I don't know. There are basically no better options. And... okay, g takes f4, bishop g4, king e8. Black is supposed to be better. It's completely mad. And I know that this makes no sense. But black is still a pawn up. If I turn on the engine says minus 1.4 on depth 20. And if you let it sit, now it's minus 1.3. But the only move that keeps white in the game is bishop h5 check. Any other move is minus 5, minus 6. So after bishop h5, king here, the bishop goes back. And now black can avoid with c6, as you can see. So black is a pawn up, and apparently white has no compensation. I think in practical play, white has compensation. But if black learns this, then he should be able to win. Okay. Let's get over to the main move according to theory. And the move strong players most often choose to play. Okay, h6, why h6? Well, this move gains a free tempo on the bishop, does not prepare e5, and does not weaken this diagonal. As we saw in the previous position with f6, there were a ton of checks and the positions were crazy. This is a very safe way to play for an advantage. Bishop h4. And now, having inserted this move h6, we are now going to play c6, queen b6, which is the main idea against this opening. So c6, e3, and queen b6. And now, if white plays b3, which is possible, black is equal or slightly better. And it has been played by the strongest players, but it's just good for black. Why? Because black plays e5. I should say that queen c1, which can be played instead of b3, is also met with e5. So this is a common pattern. After b3, e5, knight f3 is supposed to be the best move. If d takes e5 is played, then you lose the bishop, so that's not possible. So that's the idea behind e5. You can never take it, it's not a pawn sacrifice. You can play c3, this is what the engine plays, but ed4, ed4, for example, bishop d6, and black's position is slightly more pleasant. Basically, these two moves make no sense, whereas all of black's moves made sense. And strong players play knight f3, and after e4, knight f to d2, which leads to positions where black has more space, and white has sort of a good version of the French, because this bishop is not on c1, but these two bishops are going to be very scary. So b3 is just objectively inferior to queen c1, so you should play queen c1. Again, e5, and again knight f3, and again e4. But now after knight f to d2, you have a bit more flexibility. You haven't wasted a move on b3, and of course c4 is supported by the queen, so this makes a lot more sense. Okay, knight e7, c4, which is now defended 3 times. You could also play f3, which is probably better. This is basically a French defense now, so both plans are good. In the French, black plays c5 or f6, so here f3 and c4 both make perfect sense. For example, knight f5 here, bishop f2, you've given your bishop a square, and you can defend the e3 pawn. ef3, knight f3, and this is a very normal French now, but for some reason this bishop is on f2 instead of on c1, which is good. Again, black has a lot more activity than white has in the French. But you can also play c4, which is the second principled move. Bishop f5, knight f5, bishop g3, knight g3, h3, bishop e6, knight c3, for example, bishop e7 or bishop d6. Bishop d6 loses the bishop here, but if the queen moves. And very similar to a French, slightly better for black or equal. And basically, even though white doesn't have this French bishop, it's really hard for him to do much. In the French, black breaks the position and plays for activity, plays f3 here. It's hard to do that here. Here the engine thinks it's minus 0.3 or minus 0.4 on depth 25. And it's with the move rook h5 or rook b1 or b4. So it's going to be a complicated position in which black is going to always have a slight edge, but white will be okay. So let's sum this up. The best move is f6, which creates a lot of weaknesses along these two diagonals, and your king is going to be under pressure. However, you will most likely end up being a pawn up, several tempi up, with an unsafe king and a crazy position in which, according to the engine, you are -1 or -2. So if you like crazy positions, do that. If you like very safe positions, then c6 or bishop f5, play the London system. And if you would like a slight edge, and if you play e4 with white and like playing against the French, then I would suggest the move h6. Okay, so that's my advice. I hope you like this video. I hope all d5 players will now be prepared against this opening and never be, well, surprised against it again. And I hope you got something. Let me know what you think. Any feedback is appreciated, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.